Here's my once in a blue moon question. The community hears a lot about power budget. What exactly defines a power budget, and how do you determine the level of budget that a champion should get? Is it a calculation determined based on the kit slash design, a combination of things? Power budget is more of a nebulous thought construct than an actual, this spell is a 1 and this spell is a 5, right? It's not a literally, this is, we're going to assign numbers here. It's more of a thought, like it's more of the result of a thought experiment of a power budget is you look at a spell like Jin Trap, and we buff the spell to do twice as much damage in a patch, and his win rate doesn't change. And we say, okay, for the purposes of power budget, we can basically treat Jin's Trap like it's useless. Like it requires almost no power budget, because it has ultimately very little to no impact on how powerful the champion, like on the whole, is, right? Conversely, we look at, say, a champion like Corki, and we say, hey, we give this champion 2 AD, and his win rate goes up a lot. It turns out that passive is really, really good. That passive occupies a lot of power budget because it's multiplying the effectiveness of his AD, right? I would say that the main way that we calculate like power budget, sort of post release, is we see changes, like we see how the champion changes over time when we make changes to them, and we can then sort of backwards verify, okay, how much power budget of the kit is this actually, right? As an example, we had a bug for a couple of hours on live where Elise couldn't use her Q, and her win rate went down by about 12%. And so we therefore made the conclusion, that Q spell is pretty important to Elise, huh? In both forms. And that probably would be obvious, right? But it then invites the thought experiment of, okay, what about W, right? How much power budget do we think W would be? Would it be more or less, right? And then talking through those and like having that discussion can be really, really, really useful in order to be able to describe, problem statements with some champions, like, say, Renata, right? When I talk about Renata, I talk about her as, like, she is the prototypical power to satisfaction or power budgeting problem champion, where she has too many spells that demand too much power budget, right? Because we know there are several other principles going on here. Number one is that not all spells are created equal in terms of ratio of power to satisfaction, right? Again, going back to Jin Trap is actually moderately satisfying, but it requires basically no power budget, right? And so by taking power budgeting as a thought experiment and then power budget to satisfaction as a thought experiment, we can then make conclusions about kits as a whole and look at someone like, say, Renata and say, hey, the problem with this kit is that too many spells are vying for that power budget. The spells aren't good enough ratio of power to satisfaction, and there's a minimum threshold of power that all of these spells need in order to be satisfying, and the kit can't actually supply that. Because ultimately, all champions have to be balanced, which means that you only have so much power to go around for your total 4 spells in a passive, right? Which means if you have, say, 3 spells that all demand a very high amount of power budget to be satisfying, you're probably not going to have a very satisfying kit at the end of the day, because you're not going to be able to fit all of that, right? We have some spells that do require a lot of power budget to be satisfying, and they get it, and that works really well for that champion, right? Like Jin W is like this. Jin W is a really powerful spell, right? This is an extremely long range, not that difficult to land, reasonable damage plus root spell. That's a really good spell, but it works really well for Jin because it's satisfying when you land it, and he has the power budget to spare, largely because of his E, right? And also his Q to a lesser degree, because those spells don't occupy, E occupies almost no power budget, and Q is a very small amount, right? And so his W, his passive, and his R get to be really, 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 really strong. Now, there's more to it than just power budgeting, right? I don't want people to take this as like, oh, this is how all champ design is done, right? As an example, someone like Jinx actually has a different design structure, which is really interesting, which is that her W and her E are made to be useful in very different situations, right? They're almost never good in the same situation, aside from like someone is chasing you in a straight line from really far away, right? But because Jinx W and E are both very situational spells that aren't very good most of the time, she's allowed to have a lot of power in her passive, her Q, and her R. And so that's part of what makes Jinx's kit really compelling, is that August found a different way to make a spell low amount of power budget but still satisfying, is to make it generally not that useful but very powerful situationally, right? This is like Chompers especially are like this. And that allows the kit to hold different spells that, like, because a situational spell, even if it's really powerful in that situation, isn't as powerful, like isn't occupying as much power budget as a spell that is generically quite powerful, like say like Diana Q or something like that, right? It's like Diana Q is pretty much always good, right? But something like Jinx Chompers isn't, right? Like Briar Q is always good, right? It's, obviously sometimes you don't want to put yourself on the opponent, but it's a targeted stun at the end of the day, right? It's a good spell. It's pretty much always going to be good in almost every situation. And that is obviously a lot less powerful than something that has a lot of context around when it can, when it can be good, when it can be used, right? Like say Seraphine E, for example, right? Which not only is a skill shot, which makes it less reliable and therefore less powerful, but also it's contextually not even a stun, right? Sometimes it's a slow, sometimes it's a root, sometimes it's a stun, right? And so adding context to your spells and making them more situational allows you to give yourself more power budget to buy on the kit, and frees up a lot of things. So hopefully that's a satisfying answer. Has Tryndamere discussed at all? His kit feels deeply non-functional in the current state of league as the game evolved fast 15-year-old kit. So let's talk about Tryndamere. Okay, so let me give a more holistic answer about Tryndamere. It's like, I don't actually think that Tryndamere's kit itself is like purely outdated. It's like, is it an old kit? Yes. Does it have old mechanics? Yes. In the modern day, obviously we would never make facing. We would never do the Q, like the Q rage loop the same way that it was done in the olden days by any means, right? And so it's like, yes, I think that there are parts of Tryndamere's kit that maybe haven't aged perfectly well, right? That like obviously we wouldn't do in the modern day. But I don't think that that's actually what's keeping him from being functional or feeling good in the modern day. Like there's plenty of old champions that still feel good today, right? Like Cho'Gath, for example, is pretty much the same, right? Like largely the same as the kit that he had, in 2011, right? You look at like Ezreal, it's like, okay, Ezreal has one spell that's slightly different, right? It's like, I don't actually think that, just because your champ design or, the like design principles underlying your champ are old, that they necessarily have to feel bad. I think that obviously there's things that we could do to make Tryndamere better, but the way that I look at Tryndamere is that I think that his problems largely come from the way that systems have shifted around him that support him playing much more into a sustain and farming fantasy than anything that actually is in keeping with the character fantasy that he was originally given. Right, like that he was originally begun with, which is like, oh yeah, this is the big sword guy. He crits you, and he's probably really good at fighting people and not that good at doing other things. And over the years, he's gotten much, much, much better at farming and sustaining, and he's gotten worse at actually all-inning people and like actually taking, well-calculated fights and things like that, right? And so it's been very hard for us to give him the tools that he needs in order to actually succeed in fights in the modern day for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is, even in his current form, he actually still has a pretty dedicated player base, right, who still wants to play the current Tryndamere. And so it's hard for us to look at the champion and be like, okay, let's take a risk on reworking 2 spells or something like that, or even significantly changing his gameplay, because there's always the risk of, oh, we've accidentally disenfranchised his current player base, because we've changed him in a way that they didn't actually appreciate, right? It's very dangerous, right? And there are some things we could do that I think are low risk, right? For example, Wild Rift has a set of, has a slightly different version of Tryndamere that I think is actually overall a little better. One small change, for example, is that his W is not, are you facing me when I cast this, but instead, you are slowed if you are walking away from Tryndamere, but not if you're walking towards him, which I think is a much better paradigm for that spell. Not just like, in terms of like old versus, not just in terms of like when was the design done, but just in terms of like, I think the spell just makes more sense. So there are probably small things we could do, but I think it's hard because unless we're convinced that the version of like a new version of Tryndamere is a banger, we're not going to ship it, right? And I'll tell you straight up, there have been multiple people over the years that have spun up internally Tryndamere midscopes, and we obviously never shipped any of them, right? Because it was always clear, or sorry, it was always unclear when we got, a ways into the midscopes, like, is this actually a better version of Tryndamere for the current player base? And the answer was like, we're not sure, or in some cases, no. And that led us down the road of like, okay, well, we're just not going to ship this then. If it's not clearly an upgrade for his current player base, we're not going to do it. And that's what's made it hard to work on Tryndamere. I do think there are numbers changes we can do, and there are small mechanical changes we could do that would be improvements, but we haven't chosen to spend the time to do those. Again, I try to talk about this when I talk about time. It's just like every bit of time that we spend on something is time that we don't spend on something else, and we haven't spent the time on Tryndamere. I think that he would be worth it, right? In the same way that like I made a lot of numbers changes to Kled, for example. It's like I think that he could get a project, maybe even less scope than something like what I did for Kled, for example. Just moving numbers around and maybe doing some smaller mechanical changes, again, similar to what I did for Kled. I think that could be good for him, for sure. But no one has taken on that work. And it's not a super high priority because he does have a lot of players that, we survey them from time to time and they say, yeah, we have a good time playing Tryndamere, even though he's like a sustain monster now instead of a, fights you monster, right?